Expect reports from CERN.
Some things should stay buried in the past. Unfortunately, not a motto at CERN. With almost limitless funding and no governmental restrictions, we regularly revive old and terrible experiments. I say we because, although unwanting, I am still a part of this. I'm doing my best to get this information out to the public, but I'm walking a fragile line. I have now the findings of a particularly heinous case. There are many more of these trials, but time is a factor. The gamma experiments revolved around radiation exposure. Dr. Elric Swan is a foremost expert in this field. He was fascinated with a series of experiments conducted by the AEC, or the United States Atomic Energy Commission, through the 1940s and 50s. Among these were the Green Run, where the AEC released iodine-131 and xenon-133 into the Washington state atmosphere near the Hanford Plutonium Production Facility. It was spread in a 500,000-acre radius that encompassed 3 small towns that were contaminated. But the research matter concerning these gamma experiments was inspired by a different set of AEC trials conducted at the University of Iowa in 1953. These studies sought to understand better the effects of radioactive iodine on pregnant women and newborns. Researchers gave 1 to 200 microcuries of iodine-131 to pregnant women to study their aborted embryos and discover at what stage and to what extent the radioactive material penetrated the placental barrier. Another study involved administering iodine-131 to newborns under 36 hours old by either oral ingestion or injections to measure the amounts collected in their thyroid glands. After that, they fed iodine-131 to 28 healthy infants through a gastric tube to test the concentration of iodine in their thyroid glands. Another similar study was done on 65 premature infants to see if the effects were any different. The purpose of these studies was stated as the development of atomic science. But the work that Dr. Swan has done makes those trials seem mild in comparison. He continued where the AEC left off, experimenting on newborns with iodine-131 in various amounts and distribution methods for the first half of the trial. But there was a problem. The infants lacked the strength and the immune system required for surviving such hostile procedures. The chemicals had varying results, but overall ended in the same way: expiration of the subject. In experiments 31 to 60, he instead tested on subjects that were still in the womb. This allowed him to administer the radioactive materials to the mother intravenously through a drip. Getting the doses right cost him another 16 subjects. 32 if you count the unborn children. Swan's research notes indicate that the amount and over what period the isotope caused death. Swan was given complete oversight of the M-wing, which had its own subfloor as well as a 2-mile deep shaft explicitly designed for dumping radioactive waste. There are a lot of human bodies down that shaft. The woman who was deemed the first success of the trials was a one Dorothy
Redacted.
born
Redacted.
1984. Many of the candidates are admitted into CERN trials against their will, and as such, have most of their information expurgated to leave as small of a footprint as possible. However, these candidates, as they call them, seldom survive experimentation anyways. I provide as much information as I can find in these reports, in the hopes that someone can find a pattern in the abductions and catch CERN in the act. What the results of the trials showed before Dorothy were varying levels of deformities, as well as peculiar deaths. Several from trials 31 to 38 grew increasingly ill as their fetuses developed tumors or other defects and died. One of these deceased fetuses continued to twitch within the womb for several hours. This case was studied closely with extreme interest. Due to the severe amounts of radiation within the women after their trials concluded, most had cancer and all were sterile. Dr. Swan no longer had a use for them. As a self-described pragmatist, he refused to waste resources on a non-viable subject. Dead or alive, they went down the shaft. Taking what he'd learned from the previous trials, tests 39 through 46 saw increasingly horrific results. What had changed was how much iodine-131 he administered and the rate at which he did so. The isotope has a half-life of 8 days. So, if not calculated and administered just right, its levels will spike or drop drastically. There was also a secondary isotope introduced at some point during these trials. What it is and its exact effects are unknown to me, as this information is stored within the Clearance Level 1 server. The reason for which will soon become apparent. More or less, the same effect was witnessed. It was the after effect that changed. In these trials, the unborn fetus was shown to experience death spasms for far longer, causing extreme discomfort and sometimes pain to the mother. Ultrasound proved that the fetus had no heartbeat and was medically deceased. Its body, however, continued to move for many hours, and in later instances, days. In some cases, the kicking and struggling could even be witnessed under the skin. Case 131-46 lasted 2 weeks from the point of initial dosage. Dr. Swan was trying to induce labor of the technically dead fetus and almost succeeded in doing so. Complications, due to the increasingly violent movements within the mother, did not allow for proper alignment. He ordered his staff to perform an emergency C-section. Anesthesia was not administered, as the balance of chemicals at this stage in the trial was monitored exceptionally close. Once the screaming woman was cut open, the technician faltered, shocked by what she saw. This delay, according to Dr. Swan, was the direct cause for the failure of case 131-46. Irate by his staff's negligence, he turned a key outside the viewing window of test room 17. A red button was revealed as a small sliding hatch receded into the wall. Swan pressed this button and watched the room suffuse with flames. The technician, a nurse, Amy Campbell, did not die quietly. Listed on the official incident report was emergency incineration, exposure to deadly contaminants. No follow-up or reprimand proceeded. All the board cares about is results. As long as they are provided, psychopaths like Housey and Swan are free to do as they please. This brings us to case 131-47. Dorothy's trial lasted an excruciating 4 weeks. Within the first 10 days, the fetus appeared to have died from radiation exposure due to intravenous iodine-131 drip. But the fetus continued to grow at an alarming rate. By week 3 of the trial, and week 35 from inception, her stomach was twice the size it would typically be. The technically dead fetus thrashed around inside of her, causing her stomach to rip in multiple spots. Skin grafting was done to ensure the womb was not compromised. To minimize the risk of her body rejecting the grafts, the skin was taken from her thighs. Again, no allowances for anesthesia. Week 4 of the trial, C.E.R.N had been approved for a massive budget to purchase several robotic-assisted surgery systems. These high-tech units of tracks and robotic arms allowed C.E.R.N to perform the needed surgeries remotely. As it turned out, they were unneeded for the final stage of this trial. Day 28 of Case 47, the RAS systems were wheeled in, set up, and calibrated. C.E.R.N planned to perform the surgery himself and remove the still growing subject. Cameras and monitoring equipment were brought in to capture as much information as possible before the subject presumably expired. As the machine was being prepped, however, something unexpected happened. Dorothy, who had been restrained and gagged since week 2 of the trial, began to scream from beneath the cloth constraint. C.E.R.N ordered the technicians out of the room immediately and locked it down. Her stomach inflated and deflated rapidly, expanding beyond the skin's elasticity threshold and causing many large, bloody tears to appear. Dorothy screamed and struggled under her restraints. Something white and sharp penetrated from the inside of her stomach and receded back inside. Blood seeped from under her gag as the sharp point continued to perforate her from the inside out. Dr. C.E.R.N and several of his researchers watched from the observation window as something crawled its way out of her ruined stomach. A sickly green clawed hand with 3 sharp digits broke through the bloody flesh and dug into her chest, trying to pull itself out. The other arm followed, having no hand, but an exposed, unified radius that tapered to a point, like a spear. It plunged the spear into Dorothy's chest next to its hand, gaining leverage to free itself from its fleshy prison. Unfortunately, she was still alive and unable to move or defend herself. The misshapen head emerged, having no eyes, 2 angled slits in place of a nose, and a round, lipless mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth. What was once a human baby tore its way to Dorothy's face and gorged on her until she stopped moving. C.E.R.N had assumed the thing would die almost instantly after exiting the womb, but that assumption proved wrong. He let it gorge on its mother until little but scraps of bloody bone remained. Nervous about hurting his subject, C.E.R.N had no choice but to move on to the next phase of experimentation. With the press of a few buttons, the test room was filled with a gas that rendered the creature unconscious. A security team was sent in shortly after to collect and restrain it in an adjacent medical testing wing. Much of the medical data ascertained is also in the Clearance Level 1 server, but I was able to gain a few key details. Firstly, the reason for the lack of a heartbeat was that the radioactive isotope decimated the fetus's blood cells, essentially cooking the blood from its body. I assume that the secondary and unknown isotope helped it evolve instead of dying, which it should have. Not having blood there was no need for a heart. Much like a flatworm, the creature grew to have no circulatory or respiratory system, instead taking in oxygen from the small holes covering its body. These holes reflexively contract in minuscule spasms to circulate the oxygen, giving its green skin a flowing appearance. Secondly, the growth rate for these creatures is astounding, becoming full-grown within a matter of months if fed properly. I say creatures because tests 48 through 60 also proved, in Swan's terms, to be a success. CERN has created an entire wing solely to house and study these abominations. What they plan to do with them, I couldn't imagine. The board has already approved a second round of 131 trials, this time consisting of 250 cases. My connection is becoming discovered. I'll have to log off for now. Until the next.
Connection terminated.